It's nice to be back. This is indeed where I got my lofty PhD degree. I was asked to talk about something which was really interdisciplinary. Many people think of interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary as 90% one field, 10% the other. And we forget what many of the people in the sciences know today, that you can't do ethics without doing science. You can't talk about Darwin without talking about in genetics. You can't talk about that without talking about the economics with which we either fund or don't fund our work. I was looking for an idea which would carry us across fields, one in which was pertinent, not just academic, but critical to our understanding of our society and our work, but also one which has some history. And so I took on one of my favorite topics, the one I've been working on and selling since 1993, the idea of lifeboat ethics. So what I'd like to do today is tell you the story, tell you how lifeboat ethics began as an idea, how it began as a piece of law, how it began as a piece of English metaphor, and how it is reverberated through to give an assumption which doesn't really serve the complexity of the situations in which we find ourselves today. Now, for me, who is old but not so old, this began in 1991 with a story in Science magazine by this fellow, Dr. Louis Lasagna, who revolutionized the evaluation and regulation of drugs throughout the world, pharmacology, blah, blah, blah. And Louis wrote a piece in Science magazine in 1991 on lifeboat ethics and the story of the William Brown. This was the William Brown in 1934. It set an international record across the Atlantic in 1926. And the story that Louis Lasagna told was one which is the one most people know. The case is the story of the William Brown, which entered legal history in a Philadelphia courtroom as U.S. v. Holmes when one of the sailors from the ship of the William Brown, a guy named Alexander Holmes, was tried and convicted of the curiously specific charge of manslaughter on the high seas. Manslaughter on the high seas was a charge brought under an American law written in 1790 and never used before this one case of 1842 and has never been used again. And the story that Louis Lasagna told was this. Healthcare, Lasagna said, was like an overloaded, overburdened lifeboat in danger of being swamped in the financial waters of modernity. And the William Brown was the first one where he had this, and because we cannot save everyone in the lifeboat, because if we try to save everyone, all will drown, some must die, that at least a few may live. And this was the case in 1991 of healthcare in the United States. We could not afford all of the materials that we needed to keep everybody alive, and so some people would have to die if we were going to save anybody in the shaky system of American health. And so Lasagna's metaphor encapsulated the spirit of what has become the neoliberal age. Lasagna's story was taken as gospel and truth in a way which is hard to believe. It began, and we can put a date to the beginning of this assumption that we have to let some die because we cannot save old, as it began in 1962 with a Life magazine story by Shana Alexander, later to be very famous on TV, in which she spent 6 months in Seattle, down here to our south, studying and writing about the God Committee for 60 Minutes TV. Now, the God Committee was a committee created by a Seattle hospital to decide who would get dialysis of the many claimants with late-stage kidney disease and who would not. Dialysis was then a very new program. It was only 1961 that the cannula shunt was created, which allowed us to begin to do something. Dialysis is a way of cleaning the liver when it cannot do it for itself and allowing people to live with what was before end-stage and terminal kidney disease. But because there were too few beds for too many claimants who were seeking dialysis, how were we going to choose? And so the God Committee, as Shana Alexander, was created to decide who would get it and who would not. there's a hemodialysis patient with a machine a few years old. Did we want to basically give our dialysis to mothers with the children who needed their mothers? Did we want to give dialysis to the businessmen, entrepreneurs who were driving our economy? What about the wastrel poet who's writing nobody would read, but who might in 50 years be considered a great poem? How did we choose? That we had to choose was the given of the lifeboat ethics. It was the given of the metaphor. And so we have a metaphor which is driving our choices in healthcare, that of the lifeboat, which says, some must die, that others must live. Now, scarcity was soon seen everywhere. In 1987, Daniel Callahan, then the head of the Hastings Center, the most prestigious center of bioethicists in North America, the greatest exporter of bioethics in the world, wrote a book on the fact that we can't really afford old people. Now, at that time, Danny was 55. And he told us that the old people actually didn't really matter, because they were actually kind of tired of life. And if they weren't tired of life, they really cared about their kids and they wanted life to be better for the kids. And we couldn't afford all the life-saving technology that all these old people were eating up, when what we really needed to be doing was paying the money to keep alive the young workers. Danny Callahan's friend, Governor Richard Lamb, the fellow on the left, basically said we have a duty to die. Now, he has since said he never really said that. But he said, we do have a duty to die, to get out of the way of the young people. He was a governor. He said, doctors have patients, I have a budget. And there is no way we continue to support the marching forward of medical technology such that we have to spend more and more to keep people alive to lives which are worse and worse in their quality. Now, I think it was year before last, Danny Callahan is now 79-year-old. He has not given up health care, let me point out. Danny has said he still believes what he said was true, but he no longer puts the age at 65. Now, of course, this is all happening at the same time that Ronald Reagan is being made president, the oldest president ever voted in the United States, by the way. And Ronald Reagan comes in at an age well beyond that of the health care of the people who were supposed to be tired of life and who were basically taking up the seats in the lifeboat, which was swampy and leaky. And therefore, we had to throw some out. So where did this story come from? We all know the story of the Titanic, and the movie of the Titanic was well read by a lot of bioethicists who said, this is another analogy to the state of healthcare in North America. Because Canadians were saying this too. We're not quite as bad as our cousins to the south, but almost. And of course, what we didn't have was we didn't have Leonardo DiCaprio. But we have, in fact, a system which is costing more money. We can't afford to pay health care. Oh my goodness, these people want vaccinations, they want health, they want organ transplants. You know, we cannot afford to save everybody. The metaphor of the lifeboat, of the William Brown that Louis Lasagna told, had entered the language as economics, as medicine, and as ethics. The only question was, who do we choose to throw out? Do we do it by lottery? Do we expect all of those people in the room who are over 65 to please stand up, turn around, and get the hell out of here? At which point, we can't do that because I'm over 55. I'd have to leave myself, being 56. Thank you. That line never used to get a laugh. And so, forget the Titanic, which came 82 years after the original case that William Brown that Louis Lasagna wrote about. The assumption was that scarcity is a natural condition. There are only so many seats in the lifeboat. We can only afford so much. It is a natural thing. Scarcity is at the root of Malthus's work on population. Scarcity is at the root of the economic capitalism which came forward from Adam Smith forward. Scarcity is at the root of what is happening in some of the medical centers. I was working on a ward the other day and I showed that and nobody actually thought it was funny. So I was curious, from 1991 on about this story of the lifeboat, of the William Brown, Louis Lasagna, this whole problem of scarcity. I'm a sailor. I've been a sailor since I was 12. I know what it's like to be at sea. And the terror and the drama of it, I understand. But there was something about the story which to me, who has made his living as a public writer, as a journalist. I worked for CBC for many years. I worked for The Province when it was still a newspaper. That really does date me, doesn't it? I worked for United Press. I've written for 40 magazines. I've written for newspapers internationally. I didn't believe it. The story was too bad. It's the type of thing you hear and you say somebody's telling something strong. So here was the story of the William Brown. In the spring of the year of 1840...
On your first slide it said 1947.
That was a mistake.
Okay.
Thank you very much for that, Margaret.
Because I'm getting confused.
Sorry, this is 1841, 1840s. In 1841, the good ship, the William Brown, filled with immigrants from Ireland, was sailing from Liverpool to Philadelphia. On the 23rd day of the voyage, under full sail at night, it struck an iceberg, and it sank within 2 hours. Of the 64 passengers, half of them drowned going down with the ship. Half of them were saved to the longboat. There weren't any lifeboats in those days. The longboat was a 22-foot long boat which was used normally to ferry people when you were in harbor. There was also a jolly boat, 14 feet long, which the captain and 7 other people commandeered for themselves. The next morning, the first mate in the longboat told the captain that everybody could not survive. The boat had a bad rudder. It was shipping a bit of water. The captain said, I don't want to hear about it. You're in charge. Do what you can. I'm sailing off to Saint-Pierre-Miquelon. He could sail, they couldn't. And the captain left the longboat under the stewardship of the first mate. He had all of the members of the crew swear to him allegiance that they would follow the orders of the first mate without question. The first mate's orders were his. And under maritime law, that is law. To violate basically the lawful order of your commander in such a situation is mutiny and basically a hanging offense. Unfortunately, though, in the longboat, you didn't have a mast, so you couldn't hang him from the yardarm, but still you get the idea. You have to follow. That night, the seas rose. Let's see if this is where I am. That night, the seas rose. That slide's out of order, sorry. And Rhodes, the first mate, ordered his crew to throw over 15 male passengers to lighten the boat. Mostly they threw over men. One sailor, John Messier, said he wouldn't do it, and the first mate Rhodes said, well, then you're next for it, John. John Messier drew his knife and sat there on the side and said, try it. And he sat through the night with the knife. Now, we found this out only much later. In perfect Victorian fashion, after lightening the boat of 15 of the people, one woman whose husband was sent over said, if you're going to throw my husband or brother, I forget which, I'm going too. And so they basically, in a spirit of feminist equality and egalitarianism, allowed her to basically jump off and drown as well. In perfect Victorian fashion, the next morning, they were rescued by an American ship outward bound from Philadelphia for Le Havre, the Crescent, and they were all saved, those who weren't drowned to begin with. So those who were not drowned in the ship or drowned that night were then saved and taken to Le Havre. So one of my questions was, later on, the people in Le Havre took up a subscription to send all of the people saved in the ship back to the United States so they could try again. Among them was also the sailors, and they arrested one sailor from the ship when the ship arrived in Philadelphia, Alexander Holmes, and charged him with murder on the high seas. So that's the story, and he was later convicted. The first question I had was, what were they doing, for heaven's sake, under full sail in the middle of the Atlantic at the height of iceberg season, when icebergs were known to proliferate like bunnies. That's probably the worst metaphor I've ever made. Never mind. So I went to the newspapers and I read all of the stories going back of shipwrecks on icebergs, and how they were seen and how they were found. Here is a map of ship sinkings from the 1600s up to the Titanic. There's over 600 of them here, all in the spring of the year. You'll see that the William Brown was right at the same area as the Titanic. In other words, the captain knew he was in iceberg waters. The newspapers carried the stories of icebergs in these waters. Every year there were, and yet he was under sail, full sail at night when he slammed into the iceberg, as was the Titanic, of course, to be fair, back in 1912. So why was he under full sail, and why wasn't he being charged? This is a picture from an 1844 popular tale of the William Brown, where they imagined what it must have looked like in the longboat as the seas rose, that evening as the seas grew heavy. I can't imagine the terror of it, nor can you. Nobody really cared. It was a good thing that those who were drowned were not like those on the Titanic, they were Irish immigrants. Irish immigrants at that time were believed to be a lesser species, much closer to the Africans in their mental acuities and their physical strength than the good white Anglo-Saxons from places like France and England. In one sinking, it was reported that of a ship out of England that 140 immigrants and 60 souls went down. So we didn't really care about them. Once the people from the William Brown got to Le Havre, and here's where we find the law and the chicanery. There were two councils, the British council, of course, a very young fellow, Gordon, and the old wily American council, sort of the villain of the piece, Beasley. Beasley knew that the Americans very much wanted a case in law which would give them legal authority on all ships at sea, and especially all ships with Americans, and especially all American ships at sea. They were looking for a legal precedent to set, a legal case. They wanted to distance themselves and show those bloody Brits that the Americans basically had the law of the sea on their side. Lord Palmerston, and the Brits, of course, had no intention of letting the Americans set any precedents that the Brits could get. So we were in Le Havre, and the two councils agreed that they would hold a joint inquiry of those who had been saved from the ship and had been brought to Le Havre to find the truth of the matter. Beasley, the American consul, unbeknownst to his young, naive British cohort, found out that there were two sailors, one John Messier and then another one who was not named, who in fact had refused to throw people overboard, who blamed the first mate for basically being a wimp and for panicking, and thought that nobody should have been thrown overboard. They could have saved him. And of course, John Messier was still a little irritated at Rhodes for trying to have him drowned. And when the Crescent, the ship which saved everybody, hove into sight, Rhodes said to Messier, "Well, boy, you've been saved because you would have had to sleep sometime." And so Messier, who came back separately, told his story 3 months later to the Boston Herald and other American newspapers. Gordon, poor sod, his career ended soon after, didn't know this. And then Gordon and Beasley together interviewed all of the survivors, besides these two. Francis Rhodes, of course, the immigrant survivors and the members of the crew. And on the basis of that, they issued a joint statement basically saying, God works in mysterious ways, people sail the Atlantic, people die, there's no blame to be attended. And they sent them off. The day before, Lord Palmerston, the great Lord Palmerston of British politics, wrote Gordon and said, don't let them go anywhere, bring all of them back, and we will try all of the crew members who were involved in this nefarious thing. We will try them all in the High Court of London. At which point Gordon had to see his career crumble away. and say, I'm sorry, they've already gone. You know, I've already issued a statement saying there was no problem. And here is Congress's statement that this was a calamitous event and nothing more need be said about it. They had missed their chance. I know this because the depositions taken in copperplate hand of all of the surviving passengers and crew members and their questions are maintained in the British Records Office in Kew Garden. I was the first person probably in 100 years to go and find these massive sheets of beautiful copperplate hand and go through all of the testimony. So what we have is a political affair in which two governments are vying to create a trial, each one wanting the trial for different reasons. When Alexander Holmes gets to Philadelphia with all the other people, he was arrested and he was held in jail for 9 months. They tried to bring a charge of murder against him, and the grand jury refused to indict him on murder. But you see, Alexander Holmes was the one hero of the whole affair. A 26-year-old Swedish lad, large and very bulky, manly, as the newspaper said, of all the people on the ship, of the crew, of the passengers, only Holmes left the lifeboat after he had a seat for himself, went back on board to rescue a young girl. And this was great Victorian drama, I mean, in the newspapers. The mother was in the lifeboat sitting next to Holmes. The daughter, who was 12 years old, was on the decks crying, "Mother, mother, save me." And the mother was saying, "Save my daughter, don't let her drown." Mother, 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 daughter. And so Alexander Holmes, for reasons unbeknownst to anybody, did what was an undeniably heroic thing. He left the lifeboat, which was about ready to pull out, climbed the lines, grabbed her under his arms, and carried her back to the longboat before it pushed off. The only person saved who had not basically clambered over everybody else to get themselves a seat in the ship. So my question then was, why charge the one hero of the whole affair? Well, the answer is very simple. They could have charged the captain for basically dangerously sailing, but as often happens, the ship owners, the ship was insured, time was money in the shipping industry of the 19th century. Better to lose a ship or two, get to port, turn around, get your cargo out, get that ship back, than it was to take an extra day or two on every one of the sails. To indict the captain was to indict the shipping industry, to say, why was there not a lifeboat for every passenger there, was to open an old battle with the ship owners, who were a very powerful industry, had put to rest. If we had a lifeboat for everybody, we would have to raise the fares. It would be too expensive to buy all those lifeboats. It would be taking up space what we could use for cargo. And then we couldn't have to raise the fares on immigrants. America needs the immigrants. England needs to get rid of its Irish. We don't want to do that. So why didn't they charge Francis Rhodes, the first mate, who was in charge of the longboat? Well, he was put in charge by the captain who left. To indict him is to indict the captain's decision to put him in charge. To indict the first mate is to indict the one of the most valuable commodities in the shipping industry, which is a knowledgeable first mate who can do navigation. And, of course, there is a huge industry in which the captains were extremely powerful as owners as well as sailors. Couldn't do that. If you indicted a British seaman who helped throw people over, that brings back poor old Lord Palmerston. Then the British government will get involved in protecting its citizens. They will insist on the fact that because they're British citizens anyways, don't try them in America, this is British jurisprudence. It would have opened an international can of worms. They could have basically done a black sailor, but this was 1842, and as far as Americans are concerned, blacks weren't human beings anyways. They didn't have that much legal standing. We didn't want to do that. Alexander Holmes was Swedish. Who cared about the Swedes? They didn't have a big army. They were small trading partners. They had a small consulate, and he was the one hero. They knew that whatever charge he got, because it was clear that they wanted him to be found guilty, it would not be too onerous. Manslaughter on the high seas carried basically the potential for a maximum of 3 years imprisonment and I think a $1,000 fine. And they were quite sure that he would not get that much because I think they rigged it with the judge. So we had a trial in which Alexander Holmes was found guilty not of murder, but of manslaughter on the high seas. The only time in American, British, or Canadian naval history that that charge has ever been employed and ever been employed successfully. He was given 3 months more. He had been in gaol for 9 months and then left, and we have never heard from him again. The precedent was set. You are not allowed as a sailor to throw people overboard with impunity, even at your own risk. The immigrants were told they would not be drowned willy-nilly. The immigrant trade, because immigrants actually stopped sailing when there were too many drownings. Silly Irish would actually stay in Ireland or in England rather than chance of sailing when too many people were drowning in the seas. And the William Brown became this little piece of legal history, and the defense of his lawyers was defense of necessity and the defense of human nature. His lawyers said the defense of necessity is it's human nature to want to save yourself. So just like in manslaughter and in murder, I'm allowed to basically stop you if you're raising a knife and you were about to kill me, and if I kill you, that is self-defense. The defense of necessity is if we're both drowning and I reach up and I grab the ladder and sort of elbow you out of the way. I wouldn't do that, of course. But my sense of self-preservation is such, it might not be noble, but is not actionable in law for me to do this. So these are the two defenses, defense of necessity, defense of human nature, which have been used again and again, most recently in the Robert Latimer case at the, in Regina v. Latimer in 2000, I think it was 3. So the William Brown was brought forward as a case time and again as other ships sank in the North Atlantic, other immigrants went down. We really didn't care very much. Other ships applied for insurance. And then finally we had this ship, the Titanic, which exactly like the William Brown was loaded with immigrants, but it also had Leonardo DiCaprio. It was also trying to go as fast as it could. It struck the iceberg. It sank, taking some of its passengers with it. And everybody said, how could this happen? Every 5 to 7 years, it would be another ship sinking, a major disaster. They would say, how could this happen? The Titanic was the one ship too many, partly because it had so many rich folk on it. And also because they found that you cannot build a ship that will not sink. We got that nice little ditty about the Titanic, the ship which went down, can't children sing it, blah, blah. And they struck a commission. And in 1819, the commission made 2 decisions. One, by international maritime law, all ships had to carry sufficient life-saving craft such that were the ship to be in trouble, there would be a seat for every passenger and crewman on board. The idea of a lifeboat didn't come in until the 1840s, which was only for coastal salvage. This was the idea of the international lifeboat on every ship in the North Atlantic.
You mean the 1940s?
In 1919. The idea of the lifeboat, actually, the word lifeboat was coined in the 1840s. They did another thing. By international convention, they changed the Great Circle route, the route that you sail going from Great Britain to North America, either to Montreal or to New York or to Philadelphia, by 1 degree, 60 nautical miles. By convention, everyone had to sail 1 more degree south, which took all the ships from Liverpool and London, all the British ports, south of where the icebergs flow. So the problem of lifeboat ethics disappeared. There was no natural scarcity. One, there were more than enough lifeboats to go around on the ships. 2, the ships did not sail where they were going to collide with icebergs. Voila. So the metaphor of lifeboat ethics comes forward as this one about irredeemable scarcity. Some must die, that others might. Nobody had to drown. Nobody had to die. So let's go back, I think, to the use of the case. The idea of scarcity came forward, I told you earlier, with the idea of hemodialysis and the Seattle committees and the fact that there were not enough seats for all the people who needed dialysis, and the leafy lifeboat was such that we found that we had to let some die that others might live. In 1974, Senator Thomas Hart of, I think, North Dakota, stood up in Congress in the United States and said that a nation that could afford billions in deodorants and toothpaste could afford to support the dialysis of every American citizen. That in a great nation, that supporting people with serious kidney disease was more important than allowing everybody to buy cheap deodorants. And so the United States made an entitlement which said that dialysis was a national responsibility, such that everyone who needed it would get it. Now, the Republicans, I must point out, said that this would be the ruination of the nation, that we couldn't afford it, that the budget would go down, taxes would go up. Oh my goodness, it was going to be terrible, but the world continues on its way. The problem of scarcity for dialysis was resolved. And that led directly, actually, to the desire to increase the number of people getting kidney transplants in the late 70s, because it was decided this would be cheaper than to put everybody onto dialysis. Yes and no. In Regina v. Latimer, the defense of the lifeboat of human necessity was brought forward because Mr. Latimer did not want his daughter to have a surgical operation, a palliative operation, to relieve the pain caused by the spasticity. Her muscles were crunching up such that her left hip was dislocated. And there is a surgical procedure with severing, as I remember, of the muscles or the nerves, which would have freed the tension, but of course she couldn't walk anyway, she couldn't use her leg. Robert said, oh my God, this is terrible. As a father, I can't let this happen. Better that she die than go through the surgery. At the time, here in Vancouver, we were doing cost-benefit analysis on a procedure in which baclofen, an antispasmodic drug, was being delivered intrathecally into the thecal space, the space around, that's where all the spinal fluid runs in the thecal space with the spinal cord. If you give somebody an oral drug, it goes down, you've got to digest it, it comes through your body, it takes time. This isn't just main lining, this is main neurolining. People with spasticity like Tracy's, I've seen it happen, to go from this to total flaccidity. But we had not yet gotten to the spot where we were using intrathecal baclofen, 4CP, in the prairies. Hospitals in BC were doing it, hospitals in Toronto were doing it. So we have, again, the scarcity of a medical technique available in some provinces, not in others. Would Mr. Latimer have killed his daughter had that been available? We don't know. Mr. Latimer was in many ways a very strange man. No, he really was. He was medically phobic. He still does not understand why anybody thinks it was wrong for him to kill his wife. He still does not understand the ramifications of his action. But had we made the priority of the medical care such that it was universally available, the exigent medical circumstance which made everybody think he was doing the right thing would have gone. So what we have is commerce. The idea of scarcity is not that we don't have enough. Nature herself is normally a just enough, just-in-time supplier, by and large. We have short-term supply chain problems. But the scarcity that we have is not the natural scarcity of the lifeboat, except like with the lifeboat, we can cure it if we wish. It is not. The story in the paper this morning, as you probably all saw was about Royal Columbian and about how doctors want to refuse to treat patients in the hallways. And they're talking about not treating and not diagnosing patients in the hallways because there's not enough beds in the ER, not enough space. Now, I remember doing a story like this back 20 years ago at Royal Columbian, or another hospital in BC. Is it exigent and natural that we have in British Columbia hospitals with insufficient beds such that we have to try and triage patients with serious diseases in the hallways? Or, as we found out under the Campbell government, keep them in closets? I'd forgotten about it. Well, the answer is no, of course not. When I did this lecture in the United States, they told me, well, of course, we can't afford this. I said, well, if one B-35 bomber, which we have been buying and supporting in Canada and the United States, which will never fly and has got a huge cost overruns, would handle this probably for the emergency rooms of all of our country. I mean, the billions of dollars of cost overruns. We cannot afford everything. And here's where the ethics comes in. You knew I'd get to this sooner or later. Because we cannot afford everything does not mean we can't afford anything. When we decided that it was better to save people on the transatlantic run than to let them die, a number of them a year, by probability, we could do it. Did it decrease the ship owners' profits? Very short term. Did it basically give us more workers? Yes, long term. We did it in a way that was fair and equitable. When the United States decided, and Canada then afterwards, decided that we should have dialysis for everyone, was it the ruination of the country? No. Did it increase the cost of health care from the federal government? Yes. Was that okay? We decided it was. And so what we have is something, the ongoing war between the business of government is business, at which point we can have the fewest lifeboats possible on every ship, making the fastest run for the greatest return, or we can put commerce back. The idea of natural scarcity really was the legacy of this very unpleasant-looking fellow, Thomas Malthus, who assumed... Yes. Well, I mean, I'm judging him by his power, but really, Malthus made an essential error in assuming that population increases geometrically while resources increase arithmetically. He could not conceive of us growing more food for the more people, and he thought this was God's way of punishing people for being profligate and sex-addled. And of course, he was wrong. We have been able to continue to produce more food, more resources for the more people, science and innovation and technology. The assumption has been across the lifeboat that Malthus was right and that we have reached a natural limit for our resources. We don't know what the natural limit is. We know we haven't reached it. We know that the idea is wrong. The point of crisis, we may change the resources, as we did with the lifeboat, as the population increases. Why this seems to be a hard idea is because that may seem to be unprofitable at a certain point. The commerce of it is questionable. And the metaphor of the lifeboat, the metaphor of scarcity, which has become the basis for all of our bioethics, has become the basis of the ethics in which we employ in much of the government society, has become overriding. So we need to turn the metaphor around. We need to say the metaphor of the lifeboat is a cautionary tale. That we need to remember the dialysis was a cautionary tale. It wasn't that we didn't have enough, it was that we didn't have the will. In 1951 to 1953, in the last great poliomyelitis epidemic, nobody questioned the cost of the iron lung. In fact, I learned to reading Reader's Digest stories about people in iron lungs going to college, playing bridge, becoming bridge masters and chess masters. We didn't say, is this life worth living, as we often do now for the person on dialysis. The first question was, can we save them? And then, how do we do it? And the lifeboat ethics is one which turns that around and says, not only we can't save them, but sometimes we shouldn't save them, because after all, they were Irish. This takes us back, of course, to Callahan and the greedy geezers who, the problem wasn't that they were ill, you see, in the late 80s. We weren't worried about the cost of the health care of the greedy geezers. The greedy geezers, the problem was they were, and nobody here, of course, falls under this category. The problem with the greedy geezers was not that they were ill, but that they were too damn healthy. The greedy geezers were spending the money they had saved for years on vacations. They weren't putting their children through school. They were playing golf. They were marrying their nurses. When they had to leave this money for the next generation, which was the one which would needed to build the society the way we wanted. It was, the greedy geezers is a term from an article in the New Republic. Now, Danny Callahan, of course, Danny Callahan insists to me that he is not ageist. He was just being clear-headed. We have the same problem with the lifeboat as the story of Big Pharma. Funny as it is not a joke. In the 90s, the drug companies very quickly discovered the internet. And they found that they could seed some of the chat groups, which were coming online and talking about shyness, sexual dysfunction. They were talking about anxiety. People were worried about their jobs. And they created a whole class of drugs to answer things like anxiety, job concern, and to build the market for drugs for which there had been no need for a drug before. Now, the most expensive drug in the world at the moment, whose name slips my mind, costs $500,000 a year. It is the only drug for this one relatively rare condition. The company which produced it spent $950 million on production, and in the first year of sales, earned $320 million. So it earned over a third of the total cost of production in its first year. The stock shares from the day that the FDA approved it across the first year increased 114%. If we have a natural scarcity, it may be that we have to pass a law which says the drug companies cannot have to amortize the cost of production over the time of the license. That at the moment we give them 20 years of licensing for a new drug, that if the production is 950 million, with 10% profit or 15% profit overnight, they have to do this, they can charge no more than that cost amortized over 15 years plus 10% profit, which would take the 500 million and would have dropped it down to a couple thousand. Gleevec at the moment costs in Canada, 400 milligrams, $40,000 for patients. In the United States, it costs $98,000 at the average pharmacy. So we have, across this whole pharmacare area, the construction of enormous expense, and $500 million per patient is a lot of money per patient. But is that in fact a natural scarcity that we can't help, or is it because we've created a system which allows unreasonable profits? And I may be a socialist, I'm not an idiot, I understand profits are good, but unreasonable profits such that society cannot basically bear them, when the companies, which are citizens under law, could basically find a funding formula, and we could find a purchasing formula, which made the cost reasonable to bear, while we basically accepted the necessity of the production, but we also the idea of the lifeboat. Now, I have written about the lifeboat and its meaning in a number of books. And just to show you that being a socialist but not being an idiot, I will end for a moment with a commercial. I was here at ISGP when Scott McIntyre, Douglas McIntyre, I promoted him as a speaker on writing books, publishing, interdisciplinary ideas. But I wanted to pitch a book to him, and I had just had a hip operation. I was on my cane, my crutches. I came to introduce him, and walking him to his car as his announcer, I'm going slower and slower on the crutch while I'm pitching him the story of the William Brown. And what a great sea story it is, and it's going, well, it'd probably make a pretty good book. I said, Scott, I thought the same thing. So the next week I had a contract with 20,000 in advance to write the story of the William Brown, which had also been a part of my dissertation, published 9 months after I introduced it, and also part of one of my books on elder care, where I was talking about the necessities of caring. The story of the William Brown and the idea of scarcity and how we basically make it as if it were real, rather than a way of generating real profit without responsibility, is the centerpiece of the book of mine, which will be coming out this summer, called Thieves of Virtue, When Bioethics Stole Medicine. Because what we have found in medicine, I argue, is the metaphor that Danny Callahan gave us of the geezers, of the lifeboat, of the leaky lifeboat, Louis Lasagna, is what has come to pervade many of our decisions in medical ethics and medical care. And we have come to believe that scarcity is such that we have to triage at every point on the basis of a scarcity, which is one, we might not be able to afford everything, but doesn't mean that we can't afford what we need. So let us take the lifeboat ethics and remember that the real answer was, all it took was a decision that every damn commercial sailing vessel in the North Atlantic carry enough lifeboats so that if the captain was dumb enough to strike an iceberg, people could be saved. All it took was everybody agreeing, we don't want to sink our ships. Everybody takes an extra 60 nautical miles south through the winter and the spring of the year, and the problem was solved. All it took was Senator Hart making a snarky comment in US Congress about the fact that if we can afford deodorant and Crest toothpaste as a nation, we can probably, and Chanel, we can probably, well, at least Old Salt, we can probably afford to keep alive people with kidney disease. That was a conceptual leap which we have to struggle with again and again. When you hear about we can't afford it in the metaphor of the lifeboat, turn it around and say, the one thing we can afford is a seat for everybody. Thank you. Yes.
Yes.
Excuse me. I'm in line for for my hip operation in March. I'm in the queue, and so I'm going to sit down while I answer your questions. I can't stand anymore.
I love your greedy geezers, how they go frittering away their money on leisure time activities. What a good idea it might be to have them all go on ships like the Costa Concordia, and they can have exactly the same kind of thing.
What, put all the greedy geezers on the Concordia?
Yeah, ships like that, yeah. Give them Italian captains, you know, the problem goes away automatically.
Well, that's sort of what we were doing with the Irish back in 1842, wasn't it?
See, the lifeboats didn't help them because half the lifeboats were...
Why the Concordia was where it was, we still don't know. They did have the lifeboats. We also had the sinking off the coast in British Columbia, where they had the lifeboats, but everybody couldn't get out. And that was another captain who was bagged. What we also have to remember, though, is sometimes, and this is one of the problems with ethics, it's very easy to blame the captain or the first mate. But in the end, it was the shipping company and the shipping industry which set the agenda. For years, I would blame Rhodes, may he rot in hell, the first mate. And then I would blame the captain, who was a smarmy bastard. But it was the shipping industry. Oh, he was just, when you read his testimony, he was just intolerable. A first-year law student should have been able to take him apart. I don't have a lot of respect for most of the first-year law students. But in the end, the industry and the governments created a context in which we want to blame the simple person. We don't want to drill too back and look at the real issues which are coming forward. And so the captain was doing what he was paid to do. Rhodes had a failure of courage and will in a terrible situation. He told the people to come over, he panicked. He got scared, and I understand that. Not honorable, but not wholly actionable. But in ethics, we want to blame the surface layer. It's like looking for the source of an outbreak rather than the origin. When we have an outbreak of salmonella, we want to see, or listeria, where did it begin to diffuse through the population? But what is the origin? How did that disease come to the community in the first place? When I lecture in epidemiology and public health, I do this in terms of West Nile virus. We all wanted to blame the mosquito for West Nile virus. West Nile virus was the vector of the disease. How did the West Nile virus mosquito, get over here to start? It was kidnapped on an airplane out of Haifa, Israel, and flown with a bunch of oranges to New York. Didn't have a passport, didn't have a ticket, What's the first thing anybody does when they get into New York? They wanted a deli sandwich. They went and got a meat. They bought. To blame the mosquito as if it's the whole story is to miss the story of epidemiology and public health. How did it get there? The difference between the source and the origin. They're often two different things. We may blame the captain, we may blame roads, but it was the industry and the governments which would cover up anything to keep the profits going, to keep the politics going, which was the real issue. Yo. Am I allowed to say yo? Yo.
And you're ready, you can say anything. We left it open, we left it open.
Be careful, he's got a black belt.
If I could limp back there, I'd hit you. Go ahead.
You talk about how like we can just at some point make this distinction between what we need and other things that society may want.
Yeah.
It seems that there's real conflict between what it is that what we need, and those are institutionalized in the way that our governments or the way that our businesses deal with budgets. Is there I guess this isn't really a question, it's a thought. And like, how do institutions play? I guess this is the question. How do institutions play into them, and what are are there ground rules that we can make to help solve these problems so that when there is a friction, there's a method for debate or dialogue?
Yes.
Is there a criterion that we can use? Is there what's the method?
Yeah. There's both a thought and a question and a statement, and all of them are good. I would argue that's really the conversation we need to have, first of all. And that's the conversation the metaphor of the lifeboat obscures. That's the issue that should be the first on the agenda, rather than the last. Is the business of government business? As the Americans said with General Motors, the business is what's good for GM good for America? Is the business of Canada business? Or is it first and foremost the health and the welfare and the safety of its citizens? If so, if we have that conversation, short or long term, then we begin to set priorities. If we say we don't want to save everybody, some lives are not worth saving. Bald people just can't have a good quality of life. You know?
Too true.
Yeah. And, you know, I mean, there were 3 years where I couldn't find my collar. My hair was all long and red. You know, my goddaughter saw a picture of me from those days and she just burst out laughing. She said, Uncle Tom, you had hair. Let us say that we decide that bald people it's a bad quality of life and we're going to just let them all die. We could do that. It's stupid, of course. But we do something like that in all sorts of ways, economically, in medicine, when we set these quality of life indices. And we do them as much on the basis sometimes of cost of care as we do on the way we see them. There's a long history of this going back to Bending and Koch and in 1920 and on the construction of an unworthy life. What people forget is one of the impetuses for the German solution in this case on saying that there are some lives not worth living we should just let die or we should terminate was that at the end of the First World War, Bending, the doctor, there was a state mental hospital, which in the closing days of World War I had no food, had no supplies, and people starved. They had to decide to, in the poverty at the end of the war, to either treat the people at the state mental hospital or treat the other people, and they let the people in the mental hospital die. We saw this again, partly the Katrina problem. There are short-term things, but the question is, what do we see as the nature of government? What do we see as what is important for us as a people to support? The metaphor obscures that, and I say the metaphor should make it more important. What is our relation to the corporations which are more and more driving our society? Where is the ethics beneath the efficiency of the corporation? Much of what we could do is actually very cost efficient and is very humanly efficient. Some of it is just humanly good. How do we distinguish between those? We're not having those conversations because we've let this other conversation dominate. And that's what I think we should change. Yes?
Let's just focus on the economic part of the story in terms of the William Brown. You presumably did a cost-benefit analysis of how much it costs for the ships to sink versus coming down 1 degree to the south. And presumably, the longer journeys, so the journeys were more costly.
It added a day to travel. So that's an extra day basically of all wages. That's an extra day of voyaging. It's a day which is taken off of basically loading and unloading. So it will take, on a 4-week trip, it will take about 2 or 3 weeks out of the ship over the year. I find it inconceivable that it wasn't cheaper to basically, and there were ships like the Crescent, which saved the people from the William Brown, who sailed more cautiously. But we pay performance bonuses for the guys who are going fast. It was the belief of all the ship owners that it was better to occasionally lose a ship than get there second or last. It was the belief of the Titanics that this was a matter of pride for the hubris for the Titanic owners.
And it's intriguing, I mean, because is there no, within the sort of shipping archives, is there no humanitarian concerns about loss of life in the mid-19th century? It seems inconceivable.
No, not really. There was pathos. Whenever a ship went down, very often there were stories continually, periodically in the newspapers about, we have to stop this, too many ships are going. There was concern when enough ships went down that the immigrants stopped sailing. But it really was, losing 12 souls and 240 immigrants. The Irish were an unending supply of cheap labor coming out of England.
Well, no, it's not just the immigrants, it's sailors, it's folk who are doing the work on the ships.
They were concerned. Able seamen were a dime a dozen. Cooks were a dime a dozen. Once you get up to the first mate and the captain, they were precious commodities. No, I have found in the literature, to answer your question, no real concern in the shipping materials over the loss of life as a bad thing in and of itself. There was a concern sometimes over the loss of goods, cargoes, and ships, the time it took to get the insurers to pay, things like that. But life was cheap. And the pathos was in the news stories when there was a major ship going down, and especially near a coast, and especially if there was a first class on it. But that was pretty short-lived. And there was a lot of writing about this up through the 1880s, where occasionally a writer would come forward and say this was horrible. There's a wonderful thing in Harper's. But no, there really wasn't that much concern. And I'm not, yes, over there.
But an interesting, one of the interesting phrases you used, you said that it was less, it was about fear of action more than a willingness to act. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because talking with people in the States, especially people in the medical system down there, their one sort of problem is they can't act because they have so many players going on at once. And there's no ability to act. So when we were discussing the idea of the situation you're in with your hip, something about hips was the only sort of defense they had against Canadian healthcare system.
And I've worked both sides of the border. And I've had several patients I've worked with in the States and in here with cataract surgery and with hips. And in fact, it actually takes about the same amount of time from early diagnosis forward. This is major surgery. You don't do it on the first twinge in the States. You wait until it's pretty well developed. I've been on the list since I moved to Toronto. I could have gotten it done earlier. It's not an exigent surgery. It's getting a little uncomfortable. I've had cataract patients diagnosed literally in the same week in Canada and the United States, and the surgery done on the same month, Canada and the United States afterwards. But it's just in the States, say, well, dear, because there are always women over 65, 70. Well, dear, you're beginning to get a bit of a starflake pattern. Well, come back in 6 months. Well, it's a little. And so after about a year and a half, when you're seeing large halos around the lights, well, it's about ready. my Canadians had been on the list for 9 months or a year. They were ready on the list, and so then the doctor says, well, when do you want it done? She says, well, I'd like to go play golf in Florida at the end of March, so can we have it done in late January? So some of the lists make good sense. I don't think they're bad medically. I think they make good organizational sense. Some of them are bad. The great thing about the Canadian system is that when we really have something stupid and enough people complain, the members of the opposition stand up and complain. You know, the newspapers, if you had a newspaper here in town, they write articles. The CBC gets on it. We have a mechanism of public indignation, which is a political lever which is not active actually in the United States. So that's our strength. There is, however, a socialization of this for people in the system. And I'm constantly told, well, I don't understand because I'm not working full-time in the system. The worst thing which happens is that many people are made to believe there is no hope and no change, and so they stop trying to agitate for change. And they become like old legs in the prison who mop the floor. And then when you ask them, well, what's prison like, Jake? He said, well, you know, well, I don't know. I've been here 40 years. And floors are clean. That's the worst thing we do to people in the system when we make them feel as if there is no hope and they have to live with it. And that's why young firebrand, soon-to-be PhD academic UBC types are going to have to take this in hand. Lord knows I've tried, but since my aunt told me she wouldn't vote for me for dog catcher, I've been sort of unsuccessful in leading the parade. One other question?
I'm just curious because it seems to me you're talking about really entrenched human behavior here of hierarchical systems. Because we use examples of throw the cooks overboard because they're a dime a dozen, the Irish, which used to be called Irish niggers at one time.
Yes.
Whoever. And so we're talking systems where one group of people seem more important than the other. And you're talking about medical ethics, and I've attended some of these talks and feel that medical ethics is turning into a group of people, neuroscientists, cognitive psychologists, and so on, who just seem to be wanting to genetically or chemically alter new societies so that we have a bunch of Ayn Rand devotees running around.
Yeah.
That
is the danger. That is the danger. It has nothing to do with neuroscience. I mean, that's just the excuse.
No, but I've heard this similar term.
In 1951 to 53, with the poliomyelitis epidemic, which I'm old enough to just old enough to remember. You probably remember too. Yeah. It was a matter of pride from Denmark to Hong Kong that we could save people with bulbar poliomyelitis and its paralysis. Medical students were impressed, and dental students too, God forbid, dental students too, to handbag trached patients until we could get in the machines. Nobody questioned it. This is a change which has occurred. It's not human nature. This is a change which has been constructed over the last 60 years. And the first way to change it is to say, this has been an extraordinary diminishment of any real ethic. And it's being led by people who call themselves ethicists and philosophers.
Yeah, not clinicians.
Not all, well, some clinicians. Not the good clinicians. Like, many clinicians are getting socialized to this. So that's why we have to stop and say, one, it's not human nature. And we are better than we were when we said they're Irish niggers, throw them overboard. We're better than we were, I hope, in the 19th century, when we didn't let in dogs and Indians into the pub. We're better than we should be, in Hong Kong when there was no dogs or chinks. It's not human nature. This is something which has happened over our lifetime. Well, not over your lifetime, over my lifetime. We can change it. We still have hopes to change it, but we have to take the metaphor, turn it on its head, and say that this is unacceptable.
Sure, but don't you think the hierarchical systems still play a part in this? I mean, we can go back to ancient Greece and talk about women not having a vote and slaves and other things too, and we're better than we were then too.
And then we have to fight each generation to correct the inequities of the society we're born into. But this is a very severe and rapid change which has taken place as if it was ethics within the nexus of economics, politics, medicine. This is an extraordinarily rapid and fast change which has occurred in the last 50, 60 years. This is almost unprecedented in ethics, the way that this has come about, and in economics. Adam Smith, the worst fears of Adam Smith, the worst fears of Tocqueville, of all those critics over time, seems to have coalesced in this post-war generation. And all I can do, basically, in my fight, I fight this in all sorts of ways. One of the things about the metaphor and to lecture about this is to say there's many ways in which we can attack it. One of them is on the simple basis of the truth of scarcity, which is scarcity is a scarce commodity. It's one we normally choose, and we don't have to. And then, when I run for Prime Minister, I hope you will all vote for me. I was going to run for mayor. Certainly in Toronto, between Rob Ford, Clarabelle, and me, I think I'd probably have a good chance. I already have my pin saying, you want experience, vote for Rob. But as I said, my aunt told me that she wouldn't vote for me for a dog catcher, and I think I'd be perfectly electable myself. I mean, it worked in New York once, so. But failing that, I'm looking for one of you there in the back row to basically pick up the, go and take it on, and I'll work on your campaign. So that's, I'm being signaled that I've talked again too long and said too much. Thank you all. I hope you found it somewhat interesting. I hope you like the books. And I hope you understand, really, in the end, it is our power to destroy the metaphor, not simply to live with it.